Angry Birds was a hit mobile game from the late 2000s, featuring a bright cast of birds taking flight via slingshot against the pigs who stole their eggs. There would be many spin-offs, including a Star Wars game, a Transformers game, and even 2 movies. Things were going great for Rovio, the humble creators of Angry Birds. But that would all come crashing down. Rovio would announce the takedown of the original Angry Birds on Android devices, as well as renaming it to Red's First Flight on iOS, as if they were trying to erase history. And with that, a piece of childhood was ripped from the hands and hearts of millions. The only 2 games left standing pre-Angry Birds 2 were Angry Birds Friends and Angry Birds Transformers. The rest? Gone. Long forgotten in favor of their newer titles, Angry Birds Pop and Angry Birds Journey. To say classic Angry Birds was hindering success of your other live Angry Birds games raises some eyebrows. However, before we investigate further, it's important to know why this controversial takedown and rebrand is important in the first place. Angry Birds was a puzzle game created by Rovio on December 10th, 2009. The game featured birds who were, well, angry at the pigs who stole their young. The birds, being flightless however, used the power of physics and a giant slingshot to take down the pigs and their poorly constructed bases. It was such a simple concept looking back, really. You're given a set amount of birds each level, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. For example, the red bird is an all-rounder. He is pretty good against wood, stone, and ice, just no major abilities. The bomb bird, well, explodes, and herons? Yeah. The simple premise would prove insanely successful and spawn waves of content like Angry Birds with guns. This would increase in the coming months and years as Angry Birds was a top contender, but not quite the top dog. Remember, games like Plants vs. Zombies and even balloons were a thing. And if Angry Birds wanted to keep the birds flying, they needed a new game, and fast. Angry Birds Seasons dropped around late 2010 and featured levels centered around holidays like Halloween and Christmas. The game also introduced 2 new characters in Bubbles and Stella, who each had unique abilities not seen before. Bubbles starts off small, then blows up like a balloon, and Stella spawns bubbles that drops both items and pigs. While these changes seem very small, it added to a very new and refreshing experience. The game is basically DLC for the original, so it was anyone's guess as to if it would take off. The game was caught up in tons of collaborations with not just future games, but also Spalding, the basketball company. Yes, there's just a basketball in this game. The game would go on to receive frequent add-ons and updates to as far as 2015, and then some. It was clear Angry Birds had caught the eyes of millions, but nobody could predict what would happen next. Rio was an animated movie by the late Blue Skies Productions. It centered around Blue the macaw as he journeyed across Brazil to save some fellow birds. It would go on to get a sequel and was considered a moderate success box office wise. Honestly, it seemed like just another run-of-the-mill movie, but the fact that it collaborated with Angry Birds of all things just made total sense. I mean, seriously, it really does when you think about it. Angry Birds Rio was the first of many collabs Angry Birds would have, releasing in 2011. With this game, Angry Birds established itself as one of the dominant games in the mobile gaming space. The game featured characters from the movie Rio, such as Blue and his lover Jewel. There were even abilities based on the movie, not to mention Nigel and his monkey friends. We would see very few titans of mobile gaming come up after this, such as Clash of Clans, Jetpack Joyride, and even Temple Run a bit later. However, it was clear, Angry Birds was the people's choice for a fun mobile experience. The sky was the limit for Angry Birds, or was it? In March of 2012, Angry Birds would reach space in Angry Birds Space. This game was amazing. Not only did it introduce a new character, but it also introduced some sweet costumes for all of the main cast. It also added physics never seen before, creating a new and exciting experience that was different from the original, which allowed for new ways to kill pigs for their past transgressions. Angry Birds would continue to grow as a franchise, expanding and getting merchandise. Things like Mash'ems, which were sticky ball things. Not to mention the gummies, the plushes, they were everywhere. Things were going great for the Angry Birds and Rovio. Everyone was now aware of its vice grip on gaming. In fact, Angry Birds finally got the attention of a galaxy far, far away. Angry Birds and Star Wars? Who saw that coming? Seriously, Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader in Angry Birds form? Sign me up. There were so many crossovers with Angry Birds at this point that it seemed pretty smart for something as big as Star Wars to collab with it. And this game had levels centered around the classic Angry Birds formula of slingshot versus base with the Star Wars twist. There was just references and homages everywhere you looked. Seriously, they turned the slingshot into a lightsaber, that's pretty cool. Not to mention the toys. The toys were huge, man, seriously. While this game wasn't near perfect, it was a great time. And just like Angry Birds Rio, it would go on to gain a sequel, which followed the same premise, however it focused more on the dark side, having a slew of pig stages where you'd play as pigs, each with their own unique abilities, like this one being able to shoot lasers. The characters in this game were really cool. I mean, you had basically every popular Star Wars character. You had Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, C-3PO, R2-D2, Chewbacca. Every character you could think of, it probably has a character. It seemed like Angry Birds was too big to fail. And as a result, they began to experiment with some titles. Bad Piggies was a spin-off of Angry Birds released in September of 2012. While it did come before Angry Birds Star Wars, I would argue they made this to test the water as they believed the sheer power of Angry Birds Star Wars was good enough to fall back on. Instead of playing as the birds and using a slingshot, you are now the pigs, making makeshift locomotives to get from point A to point B. It was a very heavy trial and error based game, but it didn't punish you for experimenting. It only punished you for non-creativity. There were many ways to beat a level, you just had to make it a reality.
This game is legitimately one of my favorite Angry Birds games, but there is no denying that this, along with Angry Birds Star Wars, kept Angry Birds in the mobile game spotlight for a very long time. Or so we thought. We then entered a period of horrible mobile madness, where sure there were a lot of really good mobile games, but we also started to see the uprising of poorly made mobile games, only around to make a quick buck. And with the ground starting to get shaky, Rovio decided to once again break the traditional Angry Birds mold and try something a little bit new, for better or for worse.
Angry Birds Go was a downhill racer which was released in 2013. It was a fun game, but it was plagued by microtransactions and a tedious grind system. The game itself was pretty cool. Being able to race with all these Angry Birds was a fun gimmick. It was really cool. However,
this game had some very questionable choices.
Like adding a live system where racers could only race so many times before you had to swap them out. And while this game did see collabs with companies like the Goldfish Crackers, it was one of the more divisive Angry Birds games.
And the games would get more divisive from here, as a lot of the future games would keep this same model of trying to push microtransactions slowly but surely.
Angry Birds Epic released in 2014. It was an RPG game with everyone's favorite birds and pigs, but in a fantasy style and environment. While the turn-based RPG was fun, it was once again plagued with a tedious grind and microtransactions. If you stuck around long enough, you'd enjoy it. However, it had the same problem Angry Birds Go had, leading to players losing interest early on in favor of watching YouTubers like Zach Scott Games have all the fun instead. In terms of microtransactions, the game was without a doubt one of the worst in the series, with it being an RPG that had elements like armor, weapons, a potion system, and even the birds' power levels and abilities. There were plenty of ways to upgrade, sure, but more often than not, they came at a hefty price. It seems like Angry Birds had begun to lean towards microtransactions at one of the worst times, as games like Crossy Road and even FNAF would begin to come out and take the mainstream by storm. Angry Birds was being ushered out of the spotlight at such a rapid speed, and games like Angry Birds Stella were not cutting it. Thankfully, Angry Birds had one last ace up their sleeve. Angry Birds Transformers. This game is such a blur to me, and I think that speaks volumes about this game in general. Instead of it being a traditional slingshot game like all of the collabs have been up to this point, this game was a shoot-'em-up runner game? What? It featured all of the birds and pigs as Autobots and Decepticons, shooting down structures reminiscent of the original games. This game placed heavy emphasis on upgrades and microtransactions. You had to constantly upgrade characters to pass stages, or you'd risk getting stuck fairly easily. This game clearly had issues, and I don't think it mattered that much, as Angry Birds would create Angry Birds 2 in 2015, which was weird considering all the other old Angry Birds games still existed and were still downloadable.
Angry Birds 2 was definitely one of the games Rovio ever produced.
Not to mention the next couple of games Rovio would produce with the Angry Birds moniker were decent, I guess. They were all just match 3 games and nobody really plays those, so you know. Angry Birds had done the very thing it fought so hard to avoid, becoming another mobile game in the sea of the App Store. They had one last hope for the franchise, in the form of a movie. The Angry Birds movie was released in 2016, and funnily enough, it's one of the top video game based movies, and it raked in some sweet dough, focusing on pigs stealing eggs and birds getting them back. In fact, we actually got a really nice lesson about treating people the right way, and not treating people like outcasts based on who they are or where they came from.
No.
The sequel itself was also fine though, I gotta say. The movies, no matter your thoughts on them, brought Angry Birds new relevance. Finally free from the shackle of spears, they gained things like Lego sets, where previously they just had the little Kinect thingies. The games actually got updates to hype up the movie,
And it felt like Angry Birds was right where it wanted to be from the beginning. It was a popular game that pretty much everyone knew about, and everybody at least had some positive memory with. It was a game you could see a still image from and instantly get flooded with nostalgia with, games like Pixel Gun or even Fruit Ninja.
You rarely see mobile games stick around despite their most popular title being from half a decade ago. But as we would come to find out, we can't have anything nice, can we? In 2018, Angry Birds Seasons would be one of the first games to be removed from the App Store. It would get worse, as the original Angry Birds would fall in 2019, along with Angry Birds Epic, and finally, Angry Birds Go would fall in 2020. Why would Rovio remove the classics that brought them popularity?
Well, 3 years ago, the Rovio player support team actually cited the reasonings for taking down these old Angry Birds games as focusing more on their active games rather than continually updating and making their older games compatible.
At this point, we've established that the older games are pretty much better than the new ones in every way, so there's something wrong with the older games, right? Microtransactions, I mean, they've been in every game since the very first one with the Mighty Eagle, right?
While this is true,
there wasn't an obscure power level threshold or requirement in the older games. They gave you the birds you would need to win and then some. But when you have games like Angry Birds Go, Angry Birds Epic, and even Angry Birds Transformers promoting increasing the power of your characters, it feels like their priorities shifted. And with those priorities came the end of the old Angry Birds era. Hell, the only games left standing from that era aren't exactly the standard for free-to-play friendly games. In fact, the only one that's still good is Bad Piggies.
and this doesn't really look like much at first until you look at Rovio's most recent release, or should I say, delisting.
Rovio's Classics, Red's First Flight. The whole reason Angry Birds was thrust into the spotlight yet again. It released in March of 2022 for just $1. It was Angry Birds as you knew it, recreated from the ground up. It finally seemed like Angry Birds was once again restored, at least somewhat, but this time with a fresh coat of paint. It seemed like all was well for Angry Birds. The old fans could have their original experience, while the newcomers could go play the Match 3 games or whatever they want to play. That was until February 23rd, when Rovio would delist and rename the classic Angry Birds due to the impact on other games. After everything we've talked about up to this point, it starts to make sense. While Rovio is right in saying that Angry Birds Classics is affecting its other games, I believe it's not for the reason they're letting on. To remove a game that costs 99 cents is somewhat reasonable, but why go through the extra effort of renaming it on the App Store?
I know I mentioned the idea of Rovio trying to hide the game, but why?
Take one look at the readily available catalog of games. You have Match 3 games, a soft reboot in Angry Birds Journey, and whatever the hell Angry Birds Evolutions is. It honestly seems like Rovio is a little bit delusional here. How can Angry Birds, the single-player offline game, be affecting your other games negatively? I seriously think it comes down to the game taking money away from the other 2 or 3 slingshot games on the App Store. I really hope Rovio makes the smartest moves going forward, cause I would truly hate to see this preventable downfall continue until Angry Birds as we know it is truly gone. Well, that's all I got for this video, Horde. If you'd like to check something out, I got this video right here. It's pretty good if you need an extra dose of Camozombie in your life. I know I do. Anyways, take care, Horde. Brains. Ugh. That's how the Redbird sounds, huh?